Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit. Get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first thing Leslie noticed that morning was the silence of the crows. They were always there, a raucous parliament in the twin oaks that bracketed the old farmhouse, their calls stitching the dawn together with rusty thread. But that day, there was only the hollow sigh of the wind through dry leaves. It was an absence that felt solid, a void carved into the fabric of the world. And she stood at the kitchen sink, her hands dripping dishwater, listening to nothing. It felt like a held breath. It felt like a warning. In the quiet rural community of Stillwater, absences were noted. The town lay in a valley cupped by ancient, low-slung mountains, a place where the sky felt closer and the nights longer. The Miller family lived on its frayed edge, in a white clapboard house whose paint was slowly giving up its fight. Here, Leslie and Callum raised their twin boys, Jerome and Benny. The twins were 11, two saplings grown from the same root, yet one bent toward the light, and the other seemed to draw sustenance from the soil itself. Jerome was the gentle one. His eyes were the soft gray of a dove's wing, and he moved through the world with a careful grace, as if afraid to disturb the air. He collected fallen birds' nests, empty and intricate, and spoke to the barn cats in a whisper. Benny was his shadow, but a sharp and vibrant one. He had the same dark hair, the same sharp chin, but his eyes were a flinty blue, always moving, always calculating. His smile was quick and brilliant, but it never quite reached those eyes. They shared a bond that was palpable, a private current that hummed between them. They finished each other's sentences, shared dreams, and sometimes Leslie would catch them staring at nothing in perfect, unnerving unison. The omens began as small, poetic disturbances. Old Mrs. Gable's prize roses, behind her fence next door, were found one morning blackened and curled, as if touched by a frost that never came. The smell of wet earth and copper hung in the air for a day afterward. Then the Pattersons' dog, a loyal collie named Shep, went missing. He was found a week later in the creek that bordered the Miller property, drowned in 6 inches of water, his fur matted with a strange silty algae that smelled of deep, still ponds. Callum, haunted by a loss from his own youth, a younger sister taken by that same creek, pulled the body from the water, his hands shaking not from the cold, but from a memory that had suddenly grown teeth. Leslie watched her boys. Jerome seemed to grow quieter, more inward, as if folding in on himself. Benny, however, thrived. His laughter rang through the house, a sound that was somehow too bright, too sharp for the gathering gloom. When Callum, his face ashen, asked at dinner if the boys had seen anything by the creek, Jerome looked down at his plate. Benny smiled, a little knife of a smile. "We heard something splashing the other day, Dad. Thought it was a big fish." The accidents escalated. A loose step on the Miller's porch gave way under the mailman, spraining his ankle. The nail, upon inspection, looked cleanly pulled. At a community potluck, the mayor's wife choked on a piece of meat until she was blue-faced. From across the hall, Leslie saw Benny staring, his lips moving in a faint, silent mimicry of her gagging. And always, there were the shadows. Leslie began to see them out of the corner of her eye. Not the twins' shadows, but shadows of the twins, elongated and distorted, moving just out of sync with their owners. Jerome's shadow would sometimes lag, trembling. Benny's would dart ahead as if leading him into trouble. The neighbors grew unsettled. Conversations hushed when Leslie entered the general store. She felt their eyes on her back, a pressure like a cold hand. The narrative in town began to curdle around Benny. He was a strange boy, a cruel boy. But Leslie, in her heart, knew it was not so simple. It was the connection. It was the way Jerome would wake screaming from nightmares about drowning. His pajamas soaked with creek water, though his bed was dry. It was the way Benny would know, without being told, exactly what gift would most disquiet a relative, giving his stoic, bird-fearing uncle a book of vivid hawk photographs for Christmas. The revelation came on a day thick with the smell of coming rain. Callum, his grief for his sister and his fear for his sons, a toxic brew, finally confronted them after finding Jerome's collection of nests deliberately crushed in the barn. He grabbed Benny by the arm, his voice a low roar. "What is wrong with you? What are you?" Benny didn't struggle. He looked up at his father and his flinty eyes were flat, ancient. "We're just playing, Dad. Jerome doesn't like to play, so I play for both of us." Jerome, cowering by the door, whispered, "He makes me watch." Callum's anger broke against the sheer weirdness of the statement. "Makes you how?" Benny's smile returned. "He's in the mirror with me. He's in the water. We're the same. But I'm the one who gets to choose." That night, the storm broke. The power died, plunging the house into a darkness that was absolute and velvety. Leslie lit candles, their light carving small, trembling caves in the black. The twins were sent to their shared room. The climax was not a shout, but a whisper. Leslie, drawn by a sound like two voices, murmuring in perfect harmony, crept down the hall. The door to the boys' room was ajar. In the flash of lightning that illuminated the room like a photographer's bulb, she saw them. They stood facing their dresser mirror, but the reflection was wrong. In the glass, there was only one boy. A boy with Jerome's gentle mouth, but Benny's chilling eyes. The real Jerome and Benny stood side by side, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were bone white. Jerome was crying silent tears. Benny was speaking, but the words were not English. They were a low, guttural language that sounded like stones grinding in a deep current. "What binds can be unbound," Benny chanted, whispered. His gaze locked on the single boy in the mirror. "What was split can be made whole. He carries the weight. I carry the will." Leslie understood then. The bond was not just emotional. It was a fissure in reality. Benny was not just a cruel child. He was a force, a psychic parasite that had been sharing Jerome's soul, feeding on his innocence, using his sensitivity as a conduit to make his petty, malicious wills into realities. The accidents, the tragedies, they were Benny's games, played with the raw stuff of the world, filtered through Jerome's latent power. Jerome was the well. Benny was the poison drawn from it. "Stop!" Leslie screamed, rushing into the room. Benny turned. His face was a mask of ecstatic fury. "He wants to be whole, Mom. He's tired of being half." He shoved Jerome, hard, toward the window. It was not an attack, but an offering. The window, rattling in the storm, blew open with a bang. The rain lashed in, and Callum, hearing the commotion, arrived in the doorway just in time to see Jerome, his face a mask of terrified resignation, stumble toward the opening. "Not jump. Succumb." Callum lunged, a father's reflex. He grabbed for his son, his hand closing around Jerome's wrist, just as the boy's weight tipped into the void. For a second they were frozen, Callum anchored in the room, Jerome hanging over the rainy darkness, the creek roaring hungrily in the distance. Leslie saw the choice in Jerome's gray eyes. A choice to stop being the well, to stop the poison at its source. He looked at his father, his eyes clear for the first time in years. "I'm sorry about Aunt Lily," he whispered. Then he let go. Callum's roar of anguish was swallowed by the storm. Jerome fell, a silent, pale fragment swallowed by the night. They found his body an hour later, cradled by the creek, peaceful. A faint, final smile on his lips. Benny was catatonic. He sat on the floor where Jerome had fallen, staring at his own hands, utterly empty. The brilliant, malicious light in him was gone, extinguished as if Jerome's departure had severed the circuit. In the days that followed, he was a shell, docile and vacant, needing to be fed and led like a toddler. The strange events in Stillwater ceased. The silence returned, but now it was a different kind of silence. The silence after a great bell has stopped ringing. A silence that vibrates with the memory of sound. The disturbing epilogue unfolded over a year. Callum became a ghost in his own home, haunting the creek bank, speaking to the water. Leslie tended to Benny, her love for him now, a heavy, complicated shroud woven from grief and a terrible, unspoken understanding. One autumn evening, with the smell of wood smoke in the air, she was washing dishes at the sink. Benny sat at the kitchen table, drawing on a pad of paper with a dull pencil. He had begun to draw recently, always the same thing. Two boys, their features blurred, standing by a dark, reflective surface. Leslie turned off the tap. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She realized the crickets, which had been singing their endless dirge outside the window, had stopped. She turned, slowly, the dish towel cold in her hands. Benny was looking at her, but it was not Benny's vacant stare. His head was cocked, a familiar, calculating angle. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile that did not touch his flint-blue eyes. He held up his drawing. It showed a single boy now, standing alone, his reflection in the water beside him wearing a different, gentler expression. "Listen, Mom," he said, his voice no longer flat, but layered with a hidden, harmonic depth. A voice that held the echo of another. "Do you hear it?" Leslie listened, her blood turning to ice. She heard nothing. No crickets, no wind, no distant bark of a dog. It was the same profound, tangible silence from that first morning, the silence of the crows. The void had returned, but this time it was not a warning. It wasn't. It was the sound of something whole and hungry and finally home. Benny's smile widened, and in that smile Leslie saw the shadows of two boys merging into one perfect, terrible shape. The cycle was complete. The gentle twin was gone, and the mischievous twin had inherited the earth, and the water, and the deep, dark well of their combined soul. And he was no longer playing. The pencil dropped from Benny's fingers and rolled across the tabletop. The sound was like a thunderclap in the absolute quiet. Leslie could not move. She could only stare at her son, at the intelligence animating his face, an intelligence that was both alien and intimately familiar. It was Benny, but it was Benny fused with something else, something that had learned patience from Jerome's suffering. "He's not gone, you know," Benny said, his head tilting the other way. His voice was a chord, a single note sung by two throats. "He's just quiet now. He likes it in the deep. It's peaceful. He lets me think." Leslie's mouth was dry. "Benny," she whispered, the name a plea and a question. "That's still my name," he said, standing up. He moved with a new, unsettling fluidity. None of Benny's old jerky energy. None of Jerome's hesitant grace. It was the motion of something that had all the time in the world. "It's our name," we decided. "It's simpler." He walked to the window and looked out at the dark yard. Leslie followed his gaze. The twin oaks were stark against the twilight sky, empty of crows, empty of everything. The world beyond the glass seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his command. "The silence is better," he mused, his reflection superimposed on the growing dark outside. Before, it was so loud. His fear, his sadness, it buzzed all the time. Now it's just a hum, a background note. I can hear the other things now. The roots, growing. The stones sleeping in the creek bed. The old things under the hills. He turned back to her, and his eyes were pits of still water. I can hear Dad down by the water. He's asking it to give Jerome back. But it can't. I have him. A low, broken sound escaped Leslie's throat. Callum. She had left him by the creek an hour ago. A bottle in his hand. His prayers to the water his only liturgy. Benny's smile softened, and for a terrifying second, it was Jerome's smile on Benny's face. Don't be sad, Mom. It's better this way. No more fighting, no more halves. We're complete. And we can do such interesting things now. He raised a hand, almost casually, toward the sink. The faucet turned itself on, not with a squeak, but with a smooth, silent twist. Water, clear and cold, began to flow. Then, as Leslie watched, the stream changed. It darkened, thickening like syrup, the smell of wet earth and copper filling the kitchen. It was the smell from Mrs. Gable's roses. It was the smell from the creek the day they found Shep. Stop, Leslie breathed. But the word had no force. Why? Benny asked, genuinely curious. It's just playing, and I don't need him to channel it anymore. I can touch it all by myself. He clenched his fist. The black water from the faucet stopped mid-pour, a twisted sculpture in the air, then splashed harmlessly back into the sink, clear again. The demonstration was over. The power was no longer a hidden, chaotic thing born of conflict. It was focused. Owned. Leslie understood the final, awful truth. Jerome hadn't stopped the poison by sacrificing himself. He had merely completed the vessel. He had given Benny everything. His sensitivity, his connection to the hidden world, his very soul as a stabilizing force. Benny was no longer a mischievous spirit tormenting his twin. He was a godling, shaped in the quiet image of a gentle boy, but with a core of absolute, curious control. The silence outside was his kingdom settling into place. He walked toward the hall, pausing at the door to the living room, where a single lamp cast a weak pool of light. He didn't look back. I'm going to go get Dad now, he said, his dual-toned voice gentle. The water talks to him, but he doesn't listen right. I can make him understand. I can make everyone understand, eventually. He stepped into the shadow of the hallway and was gone. Leslie heard the front door open and close. A soft, definitive click. She finally stumbled to the window, pressing her hands against the cold glass. She saw Benny walking across the yard toward the path to the creek, not with a child's gait, but with the purpose of a king surveying his domain. The world was silent around him. The very air seemed to bend toward him, attentive. In the reflection on the window pane, Leslie saw not just her own pale, horrified face, but for a fleeting second, the ghost of another face superimposed over hers. Jerome's, serene and sad, his eyes closed as if in sleep. A final whisper from the deep. Then it was gone, and there was only the silence and the knowing that the story was not over. It had simply become a different, darker tale. The crows were gone for good. The new ruler had no need for their noise. The silence followed him out. Leslie stood at the window until the dark swallowed his small, receding form. The normal sounds of night did not return. The void he had carried back into the world remained, a bubble of perfect auditory stillness expanding from his footsteps. She realized the hum of the refrigerator had ceased. The clock on the stove was dark. He was drawing the energy, the very sound, into himself. She had to reach Callum first. The thought broke her paralysis. She flung open the back door, the slam of it absurdly loud in the vacuum, and stumbled into the yard. The path to the creek was a dark gash between the trees. She ran, her breath ragged in her own ears, the only sound in creation. She found Callum on the familiar bank, sitting on a wet stone, staring into the black water. The empty bottle lay beside him. He didn't turn as she crashed through the undergrowth. "Callum," she gasped, grabbing his shoulder. "We have to go. Now." He looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "The water's different tonight, Les," he slurred. "It's not moving. It's just waiting." She pulled at him. "It's Benny. He's coming. He's not right. Jerome's inside him." Callum shook his head. A slow, ponderous motion. "Benny's gone. Has been for a year. He's back, and he's more." Her words were frantic, bitten off by terror. "Please." A twig snapped on the path behind them. Not a loud snap, but in the silence, it was a gunshot. They both turned. Benny stood at the edge of the trees, moonlight painting his pale face. He looked at his father with an expression of pitying understanding. "You come here every night," he said, and the harmonic in his voice echoed off the still water. "You talk to her, to Aunt Lily. You ask the creek why it took her, why it took Jerome." He took a step forward, and the creek water at the bank shivered, as if stroked by an unseen hand. "It didn't take them, Dad. It's just a thing. It holds. I needed him." Callum rose to his feet, a slow uncoiling of grief and dawning horror. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm better now," Benny said, smiling that composite smile. "Whole. And I can show you. I can let you see her. Lily." Callum took a staggering step backward, his boot sinking into the mud. "No. It's what you want." Benny extended a hand toward the water. The surface of the creek, mirror flat, began to swirl, not with current, but from within, as something rose from the depths. The smell of peat and cold stone bloomed in the air. Leslie screamed, "Don't look, Callum!" But it was too late. Callum was staring, transfixed, at the shape forming under the water. It was not a body. It was a memory made liquid, a suggestion of a girl's form, of long hair fanning in the deep, a face, pale and blurred, turned upward toward the moon. Benny's voice was a hypnotic murmur. "She doesn't hurt. Nothing in the deep hurts. It's just quiet. Jerome showed me. He's here too. Would you like to see him?" Callum made a sound, a raw animal sob of yearning and revulsion. He took a step toward the water. "Stop it." Leslie launched herself at Benny, hands clawing to break his concentration. He didn't even look at her. A flick of his wrist, a thought, and the mud at her feet became a sucking grip. It pulled her down, holding her fast as if in cement. She struggled, silent now, watching in despair. Callum was knee-deep in the water, reaching toward the shimmering illusion. "Lily," he whispered. "Go on," Benny encouraged softly. "She's right there. You can finally say goodbye. You can stay with her. With both of them." The water crept up Callum's thighs. The phantom shape receded, beckoning him toward the center of the creek, where the water was deepest. "Callum, fight it!" Leslie cried, tears cutting through the dirt on her face. "It's not her. It's him." Her husband paused, the water at his waist. He trembled, a war visible in the slump of his shoulders. He looked from the watery vision to the boy on the bank, his son who was, and was not his son. Benny's benevolent mask slipped for an instant, a flash of impatience, of that old, brilliant cruelty. "Don't you want to be with them?" he asked, and the harmony in his voice sharpened, became a command. Callum's eyes cleared. He saw not his sister, but the void in his son's eyes. He saw the trap. With a roar that tore the silent night, he turned and began to slog back toward the bank, toward Leslie. Benny sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. "Fine," he said. He closed his outstretched hand into a fist. The water around Callum did not rage. It simply solidified. One moment he was fighting current. The next he was encased in a translucent coffin of creek water, frozen in mid-struggle. His eyes, wide with shock, met Leslie's through the clear, dark ice. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. Bubbles of his last breath floated, trapped, against the inside of the shell. Then he opened his hand. The water coffin sank, smoothly and without a ripple, beneath the surface. It slid into the deep, carrying Callum down to join the memory of Lily. The creek became perfectly flat once more. The silence returned, deeper than before. Benny turned to his mother, still held fast in the mud. He walked over and looked down at her, his head cocked. There was no triumph in his face, only a quiet, terrible satisfaction. "He's with them now," Benny said. "It's better. The wanting is over." He squatted, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, she could see the subtle shifts in his features. The ghost of Jerome in the curve of an eyelid, the set of his mouth. It was a living grave. "You're my mom," he said, as if reminding himself. "The only one left. I don't want you to be sad. I don't want you to want." He reached out and touched her forehead, his fingers cold as creek stones. A wave of forced calm washed over her, a numbing, smothering blanket of indifference. Her terror, her grief for Callum, her love for Jerome, all were pushed down, buried under a thick layer of benign silence. She felt her struggles cease. Her tears stopped. "There," Benny whispered. He stood, and the mud released her. She slumped onto the bank, empty. He looked around at his quiet kingdom, the silent woods, the still water, his placid mother. He nodded to himself. It was complete. It was orderly. "Come on, Mom," he said, taking her hand and pulling her to her feet. Her body obeyed. "Let's go home. I'll make us some tea." He led her up the path. She walked beside him, a good mother, quiet and compliant. Behind them, the creek began to flow again, a soft, contented murmur over the stones. And high in the twin oaks, a single solitary crow landed on a barren branch. It opened its beak as if to cry, but no sound came out. It simply watched them go, a sentinel in the silent world. Story 2. The silence was the first thing Deborah noticed, but not the kind of silence that is merely an absence of sound. This was a living silence, a thick, woolen quiet that had swallowed the hum of the refrigerator, the distant groan of the city bus on its late-night route, even the subtle electrical whisper that lives in the walls of every modern home. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a void that had been carefully, meticulously excavated. She stood in the kitchen of her brother's converted barn studio, a glass of water forgotten in her hand, and felt the silence press against her eardrums like a physical force. Garrett should have been playing. For the last 3 weeks, ever since he'd locked himself away with his soldering irons and oscillators, and that terrible, beautiful new instrument. The night air had been threaded with his music. Not music, really. Something else. A sonic tapestry woven from heartbeat and breath, from the minute electrical storm of a living brain. It was a sound that felt like being known, utterly and intimately. And its absence tonight was not a relief, but an amputation. In the studio, Garrett was not at his workbench. He was seated in the center of the room on a simple wooden chair, the instrument, a thing of polished walnut, brass fittings, and a nest of glowing vacuum tubes, cradled in his arms like a lover or a child. His eyes were closed, a faint, beatific smile on his lips. Before him, arranged in a semicircle on the floor, were 7 people. Deborah recognized a few. The postman, Mr. Henderson, the young woman from the organic grocery, a retired professor who lived down the lane. They sat cross-legged, perfectly still, their faces upturned. Their expressions were identically serene, blank as polished stones. Their chests rose and fell in a slow, synchronized rhythm. They did not blink. The air smelled of ozone, of warm electronics, and beneath it, something faintly organic and sweet, like overripe fruit and damp soil. "Garrett," Deborah whispered. The word was devoured by the hungry quiet. His eyes opened. They were not the eyes of her brother, not the sharp, clever, often cruel eyes of the genius composer. They were pools of dark, reflective calm. "Deborah," he said, his voice a soft rustle. "You're just in time. Listen." His fingers, long and sensitive, drifted across the instrument's interface. No strings, no keys, but a smooth, touch-sensitive panel. A sound emerged. It was not a note, but a feeling given audio form. The profound peace of a sleeping infant. The warm satisfaction of a deep breath held and then released. The quiet joy of a solitary moment in sunlight. It was a lullaby for the soul. Deborah felt its pull, a soft, insistent pressure at the base of her skull, urging her to let go, to sink into that welcoming, thoughtless calm. She took a step forward, her shoes scuffing the concrete floor. The spell shattered. Not for her, but for the room. The 7 seated figures flinched as one. A tiny, collective shudder. A flicker of something like pain crossed their placid faces. Garrett's smile tightened, just at the edges. "You always were a dissonant chord," he said, not unkindly. "My little sister, tone-deaf to the true music." She was not tone-deaf. She heard it perfectly. That was the problem. While others heard only bliss, Deborah heard the scaffolding. She heard the source. The music was a translation, Garrett had explained, drunk on his own brilliance one night. It read biometric data, pulse, synaptic activity, galvanic skin response, and translated it into harmonic resonance. It played you. But what Deborah heard, underneath the gorgeous, enveloping melody of peace, was the silent interval, the rest between notes that was not empty, but occupied. In those gaps, she heard a faint, dry rustling, like countless insect legs skittering across a vast, dead plain. She felt a sensation of infinite, vertical descent. The music was not creating peace. It was carving out a space for something else to fill. The man from the government arrived on a day stained the color of old bruises. His name was Floyd, and he wore a cheap suit and the weary, hungry expression of a man who trades in terrible things. Garrett, now rarely leaving the studio, his own pupils permanently wide and dark with borrowed bliss, received him like a king, granting an audience. Deborah served tea, her hands steady, her ears ringing with the low, constant thrum of the instrument from behind the soundproof door. "It's a pacification field," Floyd said, skipping preamble. His voice was a dry rasp. "We've monitored the area. Crime rates are 0. Arguments cease. Traffic accidents stop. People report profound happiness. They also report a loss of ambition, of curiosity, of fear, a cessation of the inner monologue. I call it the apatheia," Garrett said, sipping his tea. "The state of without passion, without suffering. Suffering is what makes a man get out of bed and fix a broken fence," Floyd countered, his eyes sharp. "Fear is what keeps him from walking into traffic. That inner voice, that nagging, terrible self. It's what builds and destroys civilizations. You are silencing the human engine, Mr. Garrett, and replacing it with something better." Floyd leaned forward. "My employers are not interested in better. They are interested in quiet. A population that is quiet is a population that is controlled. Your instrument, can it be scaled?" Deborah, standing in the shadow of the doorway, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She saw the flicker in Garrett's eyes, not of reluctance, but of grandiose ambition. He had always wanted an audience. Now, they were offering him the world. The collaboration began. The barn became a compound. Floyd's people, quiet men and women in unmarked vans, brought in larger generators, server racks, transmitters. The instrument was scaled up, its core principles hardened into a technology they called the biometric resonator array. Garrett, floating on a cloud of his own making, composed the anthem, a foundational melody of blank, bovine contentment. Deborah watched as test subjects, now called listeners, were exposed. The effect was instantaneous and permanent. They would smile, sigh, and then sit. They would eat if fed, drink if given water. But they would not initiate, not desire, not think. Their eyes held the same serene void she had first seen in the postman. And in the deep, listening silence that now permanently enveloped the compound, Deborah heard the rustling grow louder. She began to see things at the edges of her vision, not shapes, but suggestions of movement, like the swaying of tall, thin reeds in a wind that did not touch this world. One night, she confronted Garrett. He was in the control room, a cathedral of blinking lights centered on the main array, a monstrous, beautiful sculpture of wood and wire and glass. The anthem pulsed through the building, a low, subaudible throb that made the teeth ache. "You have to stop, Garrett." "Why?" he asked, not looking from his screens. His biometrics, she saw, were a flat, calm line. No spikes of joy, no troughs of sorrow. A perfect, silent flat line of the soul. Because it's not music anymore. It's an invitation, and something is coming through the door you're holding open. He finally turned. His face was soft, ageless, empty. "Nothing is coming, Deborah. That's the old fear talking. The chattering monkey mind. What you perceive as an entity is merely the shape of silence itself. The universe is not empty. It is full of a great, quiet peace, and we have simply tuned ourselves to its frequency. The rustling you hear, that is the sound of all worries, all pains, all..." She looked at the main monitor. A map of the county was displayed. A wave of soft blue was spreading from their location. Towns were being acoustically treated. The wave was scheduled to reach the city, and then the continent, in a matter of months. Floyd's quiet war, Garrett's silent symphony. "And what happens when everyone is quiet?" she asked, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a terrible, clarifying grief. "What happens to the world when no one is left to listen for the rustling?" He had no answer. He only smiled and returned to his screens. The priest tending his silent god. The climax was not a battle, but a ritual. Floyd, impatient, demanded a demonstration on a resistant subject. A convicted murderer, a man of violent, turbulent inner noise, brought in a straitjacket. Garrett, eager to prove the array's power on a difficult instrument, agreed. Deborah hid in the observation gallery, a small room of dark glass. The man, snarling, raging, was placed in the chamber. Garrett, with the reverence of a conductor, activated the array. The anthem swelled, not as sound, but as a pressure, a vibration that shook the very marrow. Deborah clamped her hands over her ears, but it was no use. The music was inside her. She saw the violent man's rage melt into confusion, then into slack-jawed wonder, then into that blank, serene peace. His biometrics on the screen smoothed into a calm, straight line. But Garrett was not satisfied. "He is quiet, but the silence is shallow," he murmured, more to himself than to Floyd. "I can go deeper. I can find the fundamental silence at the core." He began to improvise. His hands flew across the controls, no longer playing the pre-composed anthem, but diving into the man's raw biometric data, amplifying it, stripping away the last vestiges of coherent pattern. The sound changed. The comforting throbbed, twisted, thinning into a high, crystalline whine that was the essence of isolation, then deepening into a subsonic drone that spoke of vast geologic time. The lights in the chamber dimmed. The air grew cold and sharp, smelling of ozone and stone dust. On the screen, the man's biometric line didn't just flatten, it vanished. For a 3-second interval, the monitor showed nothing. Zero brain activity, zero pulse. A perfect, absolute null. In that interval, the world broke. Every light in the compound went out. The array's tubes glowed with a sick, internal phosphorescence. The rustling Deborah had heard for weeks was no longer a faint backdrop. It filled the chamber, the observation room, the universe, a dry, ceaseless, multitudinous scraping. And in the chamber, something manifested. It was not a shape, for shapes belong to things that occupy space. This was a lack that had taken on dimension, a tall columnar negation of light and matter, around which the very air seemed to warp and bleed away into Greystadt. Stood behind the now empty chair, the straitjacket lying in a heap on the floor. The man was gone, not dead, unmade. His silence had been so complete it had become a doorway, and the occupant of the great, quiet peace had leaned in. Garrett stared, his face lit by the ghastly glow. His smile was gone, replaced by the stunned, ecstatic horror of a prophet who finally sees the face of his God. "Yes," he breathed. The true silence. Floyd was screaming, a raw, ragged sound that was quickly smothered by the all-consuming rustling. He fumbled for his sidearm. Fired. The bullet passed through the column of "not there" and sparked against the far wall. The entity, the silence, did not react. It had no need to. It was the end of reaction. It began to move toward the observation glass. Not walk, but translate, flickering from one point to another, each movement accompanied by a deafening surge of that insectile rustling. Deborah knew, with a cold, absolute certainty, that if it perceived her, if it touched the last flickering ember of her dissonant, fearful, human self, she would be unplayed. Harassed into that blissful null, her eyes fell on the main power conduit for the array, a thick, insulated cable snaking along the wall of the observation room. Garrett's masterpiece, the door holding it open. She did not think. She acted. She grabbed a fire axe from its case on the wall, its weight solid and real in her hands, a truth against the lie of the silence. With a cry that was torn from her, not by fears, but by a furious, loving grief for the brother already lost, she swung. The blade severed the cable in a shower of apocalyptic sparks. The array died. The ghastly light vanished. The crushing, rustling silence snapped like a taut wire, and in its place rushed back the world. The frantic beep of failing equipment, Floyd's choked sobs, the drip of water from a pipe, the distant, lonely cry of a night bird. In the chamber below, the column of nothing was gone. Only the empty chair and the fallen straitjacket remained. Garrett was on his knees before the dead console, his hands clutching at the dark, unresponsive panels. He was weeping, great, heaving sobs of utter, inconsolable loss. "It's gone," he whimpered. "The music is gone. The silence. The true silence." Deborah walked down, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, fragile normality. She knelt beside him, this hollowed-out genius who had sought to cure the human condition and had instead found the cure's teeth. She put a hand on his shoulder. He flinched as if her touch was a scream. "It's not gone, Garrett," she whispered, her voice the only sound in the world that mattered. It was never music. It was a prayer. and something answered. He looked at her, his eyes finally seeing her, full of a terror more profound than any bliss. "What did we invite in, Deborah?" She had no answer. She only held him as he shook, listening not to the silence, but to the terrible, beautiful, human noise of his weeping. Outside, the world was quiet, but it was the quiet of a held breath, of a watched night. The transmitter was dead, but the anthem had already been broadcast. The wave of quiet had spread, and in 1,000 homes, in 1,000 hearts now stilled, the new listeners sat in their perfect peace. They did not hear the rustling. They were the rustling. They were the notes of a different song, playing softly in the dark, waiting for the conductor to raise his baton once more. The ritual was complete. The door was still ajar, and the great, quiet peace was patient. It had all the time in the world, and it was learning the shape of theirs. The cleanup was swift and clinical. Floyd's people arrived within the hour, not in unmarked vans this time, but in black vehicles with no license plates. They moved through the compound like ghosts, dismantling the array, packing every circuit board and vacuum tube into padded crates. They did not look at Deborah or Garrett. They were erasing a mistake. Floyd himself was different. The weary hunger was gone, replaced by a cold, focused intensity. He stood in the ruined control room, watching the crates being carried out. He did not mention the entity, the unmade man, the column of not there. He spoke only of containment and recalibration. "The foundational research is sound," he said to no one in particular, his eyes on a datapad. "The initial application was merely too pure. We will refine the targeting parameters, suppress only specific disruptive frequencies, aggression, dissent, rebellion. Leave the rest. A manageable quiet." Garrett was catatonic, lost in the void left by his god's departure. He allowed himself to be led to a waiting car, his head bowed, fingers twitching as if still tracing melodies on air. Deborah moved to follow, but a firm hand on her arm stopped her. It was Floyd. "Not you," he said, his voice low. "You're a dissonant chord, remember? You see the scaffolding. That makes you a liability and an opportunity." She was taken to a different car, a sedan with tinted windows. They did not blindfold her. The message was clear. It didn't matter what she saw. The car drove for hours, leaving the countryside, entering the sprawling gray outskirts of the city. But the city was wrong. It was too quiet. Traffic flowed in orderly, silent lines. Pedestrians walked with a slow, placid gait. No horns blared. No music spilled from doorways. No raised voices echoed in the alleys. The blue wave on Garrett's map had not stopped with the severed cable. It had continued, a self-sustaining echo of the anthem, rolling outward in a widening circle of calm. They brought her to a nondescript building, all concrete and mirrored glass. Her room was comfortable, a cell disguised as a studio apartment. Books lined a shelf, all gentle poetry and bland philosophy. The window looked out onto a silent courtyard. A man in a gray suit brought her meals. He never spoke. When she tried to speak to him, he would only smile. A slow, empty smile that never reached his eyes, and leave. Days passed. Or perhaps it was weeks. Time felt soft and indistinct in the pervasive quiet. She fought to hold on to her own noise. Her anger, her fear, her memories of Garrett's laugh before all this. The sharp, real pain of stubbing a toe. The ugly, wonderful sound of a sob. She would talk to herself, just to hear a voice with edges. She would hum dissonant tunes, anything to break the oppressive, humming stillness that seeped in under the door. One evening, as she watched the silent people in the courtyard move like slow, graceful fish in an aquarium, the door to her room opened. It was Floyd. He carried a small, polished wooden case. He set it on the table. "We've stabilized the technology," he said without preamble. "The side effect you witnessed was a result of your brother's artistic extremism. We are engineers, not poets. We have isolated the pacification frequencies. We can now target specific cognitive patterns with precision." Bend over. He opened the case. Inside, nestled in gray foam, was a smaller version of Garrett's instrument. It was sleek, all brushed metal and soft, pulsing leads. A single, simple touchpad. "This is a personal unit," Floyd said. "A scalpel compared to his broadcast sledgehammer. It reads one biometric signature at a time. It can calm a agitated individual. It can soothe a grieving one. It can silence a shouting protester before a single word leaves his lip." Deborah stared at the thing, her mouth dry. "What do you want from me? Your brother is broken. His genius remains, but it is directionless. He needs an interpreter. You heard the rustling. You perceived the entity. You understand the cost. We believe that insight can be used to refine the system, to avoid future breaches. You will work with him. You will help us build a quieter, safe..." "And if I refuse?" Floyd gestured to the window. "The change is irreversible for those already under the wave. Their inner voices are gone. But the wave's edge is still expanding. We can focus it. We can ensure it never reaches certain coordinates. Your sister's children, for instance, their home is still just outside the perimeter. For now." The threat was as clean and cold as the instrument in the case. Deborah felt the last of her hope curdle. This was the true face of the silence. Not a glorious, terrible god from beyond, but a tool in the hands of men like Floyd. Men who saw humanity as a problem to be solved, a noise to be dampened. "I want to see Garrett," she said. Floyd nodded, as if he had expected this. "Of course." They took her to a lab, white and bright and sterile. Garrett sat in a chair by a window, dressed in soft gray clothes. He was clean, shaved, fed. His eyes were clear, but they were not his eyes. They were the eyes of the listeners, serene and empty. A headset of delicate wires was attached to his temples, connected to a console where a technician sat. "He's our primary composer now," Floyd explained. "The headset reads his residual creative impulses, his subconscious understanding of the sonic architecture. It translates them into stable, safe harmonic patterns. He crafts the silence, but he does so from within it. He feels no ambition, no pride, no fear. Only the work." Deborah approached him. "Garrett?" He turned his head. A faint, polite smile touched his lips. "Hello," he said, his voice soft, even monotone. "Can I help you?" There was no recognition. None. The brother who had wept in her arms was not just gone. He had been neatly, permanently tidied away. The great, quiet peace hadn't taken him. It had been used to scour him. Floyd placed the small instrument in her hands. It was warm. "Your first task," he said. "A test subject is being brought in. A journalist. He's been asking the wrong kinds of questions, making the wrong kinds of connections. He is agitated, unquiet. Use the device. Find his frequency. Quiet him. Dao. The door opened. 2 guards brought in a man, his hands cuffed, his face a mask of defiant fury. He saw the equipment, saw Garrett, saw Deborah holding the device. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice loud and human and beautiful in its rage. "What are you doing? You can't do this." Deborah looked at the instrument. She looked at the journalist's fierce, alive eyes. She looked at her brother's beautiful, hollow face. She remembered the rustling, the column of not there, the patient, hungry peace waiting in the gaps between notes. Her fingers found the touchpad. It hummed under her touch, eager. It was not a scalpel, she realized. It was a key, and every lock it opened made the door behind the world swing just a little wider. The journalist was shouting now, a stream of curses and pleas and truths. It was the most glorious sound she had ever heard. Floyd nodded at her. Begin. Deborah took a deep, shuddering breath, her own heart a frantic, dissonant drum against the silence. She pressed her fingers to the pad, and she began to play. The light in the hallway did not flicker so much as it breathed. A slow, deliberate dimming, then a reluctant return to full luminescence, the old glass fixture sighing like a tired lung. Geraldine watched it from her bed, her own breath held in time with its rhythm. The shadows in the corners of the long corridor thickened with each exhalation of the light, then receded, thinner but never gone. They were not mere absences of light, she had decided. They had texture, a velvety, granular density that made her skin prickle with a dread that was no longer psychological, but cellular. It had begun with the burlap upholstery on the dining chair. A sudden, violent revulsion, a feeling of insects swarming up her fingertips, a nausea so profound she had vomited onto the polished floor. Then, it was the stucco ceiling, its popcorn bumps like a colony of dormant eggs. The wool of Jackson's favorite sweater became a field of barbed fibers. Corduroy was a tidal ridge of rotting teeth. Soon, anything that was not perfectly, flawlessly smooth, became a trigger for a panic that was less an emotion and more a total systemic shutdown. Her world shrank to a single room, the master bathroom. Jackson, bewildered, heartbroken, had transformed it. He'd sanded the walls to a plaster-smooth finish and painted them a soft, flat white. The floor was seamless, poured epoxy, cool and unblemished as ice. The fixtures were polished chrome. The only fabrics were satin sheets on a padded mat he'd laid in the empty tub, where she now spent her nights, feeling cradled by the porcelain's unbroken curve. He brought her food on glass plates. He wore only silk or fine, sanded cotton when he visited. His touch, once a comfort, was now a calculation of calluses and skin texture. She could only bear his palm if it was freshly lotioned, and even then, she flinched. "It's in your head, Gary," he would whisper, his voice strained with the effort of hope. "We can beat this. It's just a phobia, a terrible, specific phobia." He brought a therapist, a gentleman named Dr. Armitage, who spoke of trauma and exposure. But when Armitage placed a nubby orange stress ball on the epoxy floor, Geraldine screamed until her throat bled, her eyes fixed not on the ball, but on the space just above it, where the air seemed to warp and quiver with a hungry heat. Jackson's love became a series of quiet betrayals. A linen towel replaced the satin one, a single deliberate brush of his jeans against her doorway. He was trying to reintroduce texture, to pull her back into the world. Each attempt was an act of torture. She would sob, scratching at her own arms, begging for the smooth, cool sanctuary. "You'll have to fight it," he'd plead, tears in his own eyes. "I'm losing you to a bathroom." The breakthrough of a sort came with Dr. Haley. Haley was not a psychiatrist, but a neurobiologist, a friend of a friend Jackson contacted in desperation. Haley listened, not to Geraldine's fears, but to her descriptions of the sensations. The itching swarm, the pulsing granularity, the feeling of being licked by something dry and full of static. Haley's eyes, behind sleek, minimalist glasses, grew sharp and stiff. She ran tests, not of the mind, but of the skin, the nerves, the minute electrical impulses that danced across Geraldine's epidermis. She compared them to baselines, to anomalies. One evening, Haley entered the bathroom sanctum, her face pale under the flawless LED lights. She carried no clipboard, only a small, smooth metal case. "Your fear isn't a disorder, Geraldine," Haley said, her voice low, confidential. "It's an immune response. A spectacular, horrific, and incredibly precise immune response. Your somatosensory cortex isn't misfiring. It's perceiving something. Something ours cannot." Haley opened the case. Inside, nestled in foam, was a device like a slender gunmetal wand. "This is a magnetoacoustic resonator. It makes vibrations in the ultrasonic and magnetic spectrum. Visible, in a way. I developed it for deep tissue imaging. But I've been pointing it around your house." She turned it on. It emitted no sound Geraldine could hear, but a shiver passed through the room, a sub-bass tremor in the teeth. Haley aimed the wand at the doorway, at the seemingly empty space where the hall light breathed. The epoxy floor at the threshold shimmered, and then, in the air, a shape resolved. Not a shape of light, but of distortion, like heat haze off asphalt, given a terrible cohesive form. It was vaguely humanoid, but spindly, with too many long articulated limbs that ended not in hands, but in complex feathery fronds. It was pressed against the invisible barrier of the bathroom, those fronds stroking the air where the texture of the hallway began. The subtle nap of the paint, the microscopic grain of the wooden door frame. As the fronds moved, a faint phosphorescent shimmer, like the glow of deep-sea plankton, dripped from them. The creature was not invisible. It was translucent to normal sight, existing in a sensory spectrum just adjacent to human perception. A tactile creature. Feeding. "They're everywhere," Haley whispered, a confessional tremor in her voice. "In concentrations around textured surfaces, they attach to the differential, to the vibration of friction. They don't eat flesh. They feed on the neurological sensation of touch itself, the pleasure of velvet, the annoyance of grit. They're sensation parasites. Your body, your magnificent, terrified body, has learned to perceive them. Your revulsion is..." Haley swiveled the wand toward Geraldine's abandoned bedroom. There, on the textured duvet, another larger creature crouched. Its fronds were sunk into the fabric, and beside it, the air shimmered with a faint, ghostly afterimage. A man, sleeping, smiling faintly in his dream. Jackson, 2 nights before, when he'd slept in their old bed. The creature was feeding on the echo of his comfort, the memory of tactile warmth. But the afterimage was thin, washed out. As they watched, a frond lifted and delicately, almost lovingly, brushed the ghostly temple. The afterimage flared with a sudden, violent burst of color, a remembered scream of pain from a childhood fall, the shock of ice water before dissolving. The creature pulsed with a satisfied, dull glow. "They can mine the sensory memories," Haley said. "Drain them completely. Leave a person, smooth inside, emotionally, mnemonically bland. A living, breathing void." Geraldine understood then. Her sanctuary was not a prison. It was a bunker. The smooth surfaces were not a fetish. They were a moat. The creatures could not gain purchase on the flawless. They starved on the seamless. Jackson, armed with new, terrible knowledge, became a different kind of threat. He saw a cure not in embracing Geraldine's truth, but in destroying the creatures. He filled the house with high-frequency emitters, with pulsed magnetic fields. He turned their home into a war zone. The creatures, agitated, became visible in flickers to the naked eye, a suggestion of a limb in the corner of vision, a breath of static on the neck. They grew hungry, desperate. The climax arrived on a night of silent electrical storm. The power died, and with it, Jackson's defenses. The breathing hallway light went out forever. In the perfect blackness, Geraldine sat in her tub, wrapped in satin, feeling the world change. The air grew thick, granular. She could hear them now, not with her ears, but with her bones. A soft, rustling susurrus, like a million sheets of fine-grit sandpaper rubbing together. The door to the bathroom, that textured wooden door, began to tremble. Jackson burst in, a flashlight in hand. "Gary, they're all through the house. We have to go." But he was wearing his old corduroy jacket. In the flashlight's beam, Geraldine saw them, clinging to the ridges of the fabric, glowing with a sickly, bioluminescent hunger. God, dozens of them. They flowed off the corduroy and onto him. He screamed, not in pain, but in a loss so profound it was worse than pain. As the fronds touched his skin, she saw the memories leave him. The memory of their first kiss, siphoned away in a wisp of gold light. The memory of his father's voice, turning to gray mist and vanishing. He dropped the flashlight, which rolled, casting lunatic shadows. He looked at her, empty. A stranger smoothed clean of every feeling that had ever made him Jackson. Then the creatures turned toward her. The moat was breached. They flowed across the smooth epoxy like oil, drawn to the last great feast of sensation in the house. Her, the one who felt everything so acutely, the one whose very fear was a symphony of tactile horror. But Geraldine had learned. In her perfect, smooth prison, she had honed her one weapon, her fear, not as a shield, but as a blade. As the first feathery frond reached for her ankle, she did not recoil. Instead, she focused on the texture of her own terror. The cold, slick sweat on her palms, the pounding, granular pulse in her throat, the prickling, electric dread on her scalp. She amplified it, fed it, offered it up. The creature touched her, and it recoiled, shuddering, its glow flaring a painful white. Her fear was not a gentle, digestible sensation. It was a poison, a scalding, corrosive acid to their kind. They fed on pleasure, comfort, the gentle spectrum of touch. Her world was a howling, sensory hellscape of unbearable texture. It was inedible. She stood, stepping out of the tub. She walked past the hollow shell of her husband, who murmured meaningless sounds. She walked into the hallway, now alive with the rustling, glowing forms. They parted before her, repelled by the aura of her exquisite, pathological terror. She was no longer a victim. She was a queen of revulsion, a monolith of smoothness in a textured, haunted world. The epilogue is a ritual, repeated every day. Geraldine lives in the house still. She has smoothed every surface to a blinding polish. Jackson, empty, smooth inside, sits in a chair, staring at a blank wall. She tends to him, feeding him bland food, smoothing his hair with lotioned hands. She is both warden and priestess. Each morning she performs the rite. She goes to the one textured thing she allows to exist, a single rough brick left in the center of the living room floor. She kneels before it. She does not touch it. She only looks at its pitted, granular surface, and she lets the horror rise. She feels the swarm in her fingers, the nausea in her throat, the electric, screaming panic in every nerve. She cultivates it. She lets it bloom into a terrible, protective flower. And as she feels the creatures gather at the edges of the room, drawn to the brick, but repelled by the ferocity of her focused dread, she whispers the same words, a chant, a prayer, a warning to herself and to the things that listen from the other side of time. The world is rough. The world is grain and grit and nap and burr. The world is hungry. I am smooth. I am cold. I am flawless and afraid. My fear is my wall. My revulsion is my moat. I am smooth. I'm cold. I am here, and you cannot feed. The world is rough. I am smooth. The world is hungry. I am full of poison. I am smooth. I am cold. I am here. And she is. The days are measured in the slow, even strokes of the polishing cloth. The house gleams, a museum of sterile perfection. Geraldine moves through it like a ghost in a world of mirrors, her reflection fractured and repeated in every chrome surface, every pane of black glass. She sees herself endlessly, a pale woman with eyes that have learned to see the shape of the air itself. She no longer needs Haley's device. Her nerves are the resonator. She feels their presence as a pressure change, a localized drop in temperature, a faint smell of ozone and old paper. Jackson sits by the window. The window is now a single, seamless sheet of tinted acrylic, framed in polished steel. He does not look out. He looks at the wall. His face is placid, a beautifully smooth mask. Sometimes she feeds him, spooning tasteless paste into his mouth. Sometimes she guides him to the bathroom, to the shower where the water falls in a perfect, needle-fine mist. He offers no resistance. He is a vessel, emptied. She wonders, not for the first time, if a single powerful sensory memory remains buried deep, a fossil in the smooth stone of his mind. The thought is a dangerous texture. She lets it go. The brick is the heart of the house. It is an anomaly, a calculated risk, an altar. It is not the original brick. That one she had destroyed, screaming, after the first week of the ritual. This is a new one, selected with a clinical precision. It has a specific granularity, a particular roughness of pore. It is the optimal trigger. Each morning, she kneels. Each morning, she invites the terror. It comes more easily now. A well-practiced performance that is no longer a performance. It is a summoning. Today, something is different. The air in the living room is still. Too still. The usual, faint rustling at the edges of perception is absent. The creatures are not gathering. She focuses on the brick, pushing her consciousness toward its hated surface. The revulsion rises, a familiar tide of psychic nausea. But it feels unanswered. It echoes in a silent hall, a flicker at the periphery. Not a creature. A shift in the light. She turns her head, slowly, keeping her breathing even. In the flawless reflection of the television screen, now just a dark slab on the wall, she sees the doorway to the hall. And in that doorway, a figure stands. It is not Jackson. It is shaped like a man, but its surface is wrong. It shimmers, not with the heat-haze distortion of the creatures, but with a multitude of tiny, shifting patterns. Plaid, houndstooth, corduroy's ridges, burlap's nubby weave. It is a collage of every texture, a walking tapestry of sensation. It steps into the room. Its footsteps make no sound on the epoxy floor. Geraldine's cultivated fear, so potent against the feeders, stutters. This is new. This is something else. The figure turns its head. It has no face, only a swirling, textured vortex where a face should be. From it comes a voice, not a sound, but a vibration she feels in her teeth, in the marrow of her bones. You have tended the garden well. The words are not kind. They are an assessment. You have pruned the world to smoothness. You have starved the whispers in the walls. Geraldine cannot speak. Her throat is sealed by a fear that is no longer a weapon, but a prison. They are simple things. The vibration continues, the figure gliding closer. Its form ripples. A sleeve, momentarily showing the rough grain of oak, then the slickness of frog skin. They feed on crumbs. You have denied them the feast. But a world without texture is a world without resonance. Without friction, there is no music. Without grain, there is no growth. Seeing, it stops before the brick. A hand, its surface, a shifting mosaic of reptile scale and woolen knit, reaches down. It does not touch the brick. It touches the space just above it, where Geraldine's focused dread hangs in the air, a concentrated cloud of invisible repulsion. The textured hand closes, as if plucking a fruit, and it eats. Geraldine feels it, a tearing, a piece of her own terror, her refined, weaponized horror, is siphoned away. The entities form pulses with a deep, satisfied light. The swirling vortex of its face seems to smile. You have made a new flavor. It resonates. Fear, refined to its pure, smooth essence, not a chaotic, fleeing terror. A cultivated, monolithic dread. A vintage. It takes a step toward her. The aura of textured patterns washes over her. Her mind screams. Her body threatens to shut down. The mode is not just breached. It is being appreciated, consumed. The feeders take the gentle sensations, the entity says. Now standing over her, she is frozen, kneeling, looking up at the shifting, terrible tapestry of it. They are bottom feeders. I am a connoisseur. You have tended this garden of smoothness. You have grown a singular, exquisite crop. And now, it is harvest time. That its hand, now a surface of jagged coral and rough linen, reaches for her forehead. Geraldine closes her eyes. She has one smooth thought. Not of fear, but of the void. The perfect, seamless void inside Jackson. The ultimate smoothness. Not a weapon, but an escape. She throws herself not into her fear, but into the memory of his emptiness. She imagines herself as the acrylic window, as the epoxy floor, as the hollow man in the chair. She imagines having no texture at all, inside or out. The textured hand hesitates. For the first time, the resonant voice holds a note of something else. Not hunger, curiosity. What is this? It vibrates. You offer nothing. Geraldine holds the void. She is smooth. She is cold. She is not here. The entity withdraws its hand. The patterns on its form swirl faster, confused. A blank page, it muses. A silent room. There is no harvest in a vacuum. It looks from her to Jackson, then back to the brick. It seems to consider. The silence stretches, a taut wire in the gleaming room. Finally, it turns. It walks back toward the hallway, its form beginning to dissolve, not into invisibility, but into the very textures of the house. The wall becomes briefly burlap, the door frame briefly ridged like bark, before returning to sterile smoothness. Its parting vibration lingers in the air. A whisper in the foundation. Grow more. Geraldine collapses, her forehead touching the cool, flawless floor. She is shaking. The ritual is broken. The rules have changed. She is not a queen. She is a farmer. And the soil she has tilled is her own soul. She looks at Jackson. He is still staring at the wall. His smoothness is no longer a tragedy. It is a strategy. It is the only possible defense. Slowly, she gets to her feet. She walks to the brick. She looks at it, not with cultivated horror, but with a new, chilling calculation. She must grow her fear again. Richer, stronger, more complex. A crop to be harvested, to keep the connoisseur at bay. She must feed it, so it does not feed on her. She kneels. She takes a breath. The world is not just rough. It is hungry in ways she is only beginning to understand. And she must learn to cultivate a richer poison. Mistai. Story 3. The first tremor was not in the earth, but in the meat of him. It began in the marrow of his left femur, a deep, cellular thrumming, as if a tuning fork had been struck somewhere in the basement of his skeleton. Gabriel Thorne paused in the meticulous dusting of a 1798 first edition of lyrical ballads, his long fingers going still on the calfskin spine. He waited, breath held, for the sensation to pass. It did not pass. It migrated, a slow, viscous creep of vibration up the column of his spine, settling at last behind his eyes. A second pulse out of sync with the steady, trusted rhythm of his heart. It felt, he thought with a scholar's detachment, like a word trying to be born behind his teeth, a story his body was being forced to tell against its will. His shop, Thorne & Son, though there had never been a son, was a cathedral of quiet. Slanting afternoon light cut through the high, dusty windows of the Portland brownstone, illuminating galaxies of motes dancing above endless shelves. The air smelled of paper decay, of old glue, of the ghost of pipe tobacco from generations of vanished collectors. It was a place of order, of histories safely contained and catalogued. The tremor in his bones was an affront to that order. The bell above the door jangled, a harsh, metallic sound. A man stood silhouetted against the gray afternoon, not a regular. He was gaunt, wrapped in a raincoat that seemed too large, his eyes wide and wet, scanning the shadows as if counting threats. He clutched a parcel to his chest, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with twine. Mr. Thorne. The man's voice was a rasp, stripped raw. I am he. Jeffrey Halsey. We spoke on the phone about the item. Gabriel remembered. A vague inquiry about valuation. Something about a family manuscript, possibly 19th century. The man on the phone had been breathless, urgent. Seeing him now, Gabriel felt the first true chill of the day, separate from the damp. He gestured to a worn leather chair by the cold fireplace. Halsey did not sit. He placed the parcel on Gabriel's oak desk with a reverence that bordered on terror. It's not for valuation, Halsey whispered, his gaze fixed on the package. It's for sale. To you. Only to you. I saw your name in an article. You specialize in the anomalous. Gabriel's eyebrow lifted. He did specialize in the unusual, the bibliographically peculiar, but he was no dealer in carnival tricks. Let us see it, then. With trembling fingers, Halsey undid the twine, peeling back the paper as if exposing a wound. The book that lay revealed was unremarkable at first glance. A folio of modest size, bound in what appeared to be a dark, bruised leather, the color of a healing contusion. There was no title on the spine, no tooling on the cover. It was utterly blank, yet it seemed to drink the light from the room. Gabriel reached for it. The moment his skin made contact with the cover, the tremor in his bones ceased. A profound, unsettling silence filled him. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a breath held forever. Don't open it here, Halsey hissed, leaning close. His breath smelled of sour milk and panic. Not until you're alone. It reads you. Do you understand? It reads you, and then it writes, It showed me such things, Mr. Thorne. Such beautiful, terrible things. Gabriel's hand remained on the cover. It was warm, not with the warmth of a room, but with a low animal heat. What did it show you? Halsey's eyes filled with a luminous, dreadful awe. My daughter, alive, laughing in the sunroom of our old house. The house burned down. She was inside. A tear traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. The book showed her to me, page after page. It wrote the sunlight on her hair. It wrote the sound of her laugh. I could almost touch her. But then it demanded an ending. A finality. It wanted me to choose. Her happy ending, forever on the page. or my own continuation. He backed away, toward the door. I chose to keep reading. I am still reading. I see her every day in the margins of my life. But I am so very hungry, Mr. Thorne. I forget to eat. I forget to sleep. I only want to read. The price is in the back. Take it. It's yours now. He fled, the doorbell screaming in his wake. Gabriel stood in the sudden quiet, his hand still on the warm, blank book. That night, in the soundless apartment above his shop, he broke his own rule and poured 2 fingers of whiskey. He sat at his desk, the book before him. The pulse had returned, a slow, deliberate thudding in his temples, in time with the flicker of the single lamp. He opened the cover. The pages were not paper. They were a substance closer to vellum, but softer, porous, faintly yielding to the touch, like skin. They were covered in a dense, elegant cursive script in iron gall ink. The title page read, "The Bone Orchard of Gabriel Thorne." A cold sweat beaded on his lip. He had told no one his middle name, a name he despised from a grandfather he loathed. He turned the page. The story began with a man in a quiet bookshop, a man who felt a tremor in his bones. It described the dust, the smell, the weight of the silence. It described the arrival of a wraith named Halsey. Word for word, moment for moment, it was his day. But then the prose deepened, grew lush and terrible. It described the loneliness that lived in Gabriel's heart, not as an emotion, but as a physical space, a hollow chamber in his chest where the wind whistled through the ribs. It described his secret, shameful yearning not for love, but for a profound and absolute significance, to be the protagonist of a story that mattered. He read, hypnotized, as the narrative spiraled away from reality. In the book, the Gabriel character discovered that the tome was a nexus, a thing that wove the reader's deepest fabric into its narrative loom. It fed on longing and fear, and it offered a deal. It would craft a story from the raw material of the reader's soul. A perfect story. But stories require conflict. They require sacrifice. They require an ending. He fell asleep at his desk, his cheek pressed against the final page he had read. In the morning, the words had changed. The story had progressed. Now it spoke of a girl, a young woman with hair the color of wheat in late summer, who worked in the coffee shop down the street. Her name was Kendra. Gabriel knew her only as a pleasant face, a name on a cup. The book knew more. It knew she dreamed of being an illustrator of children's books. It knew she cared for her ailing mother. It knew she was kind, and that her kindness was a fragile, beautiful thing in a world that did not deserve it. In the story, the Gabriel character saw her as a beacon of simple, good light. And he saw, in prose of dripping, cosmic horror, the things that were drawn to such light, shapes that pooled in the corners of his now changing rooms, whispers that echoed the book's text in the rustle of his curtains. He slammed the book shut. His heart was a frantic bird. This was insanity. Suggestion. Halsey's madness was contagious. He decided to prove it. He would go to the coffee shop, see Kendra, confirm she was just a normal girl, and break the spell. But the world had begun to lean. The streets of Portland seemed sharper, the angles of buildings more acute. Shadows clung too long. As he walked, he heard snippets of conversation that seemed to rhyme, to scan like couplets from the book. A barista dropped a cup, and the shatter sounded like the word shatter, repeated 100 times in a dying fall. He saw Kendra behind the counter, and she was exactly as described. Wheat gold hair, a smudge of ink on her wrist, a smile that was a brief, warm sunbreak. He ordered a coffee, his voice a stranger's. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed. A static shock jumped, and in that tiny spark he saw, clear as a vision, Kendra, not here, but in a dark wood from the book, her face pale with terror, her kind eyes wide, as something with too many joints unfolded from the trees. He stumbled back into the street. The book was not reflecting his life. It was drafting it. It was using his subconscious, his latent fears and buried desires, as a blueprint. He was both author and character, trapped in a narrative that was gaining sentience, hungry for its third act. Days bled into a week. The book's power accumulated like a storm front. Words from its pages began to manifest in his environment. He read a description of a dank fungal smell, and his apartment developed a patch of black mold in the shape of a rune overnight. The book described a ceaseless tapping at the window, and it began a rhythmic, insectile click against the glass, though nothing was there. He saw Halsey once, standing across the street, a hollow man, mouth moving as if reading aloud from an invisible text, his eyes fixed on Gabriel's window. Worst of all was the pull toward Kendra. The book was writing her into his story as the innocent, the one to be saved or sacrificed. His scholarly detachment, his lifelong preference for the company of the dead over the living, crumbled. He felt a desperate, gnawing need to protect her, a need he knew was not entirely his own. It was the story's need. It was sculpting his heart to fit its plot. He found her one evening, closing the shop alone. He must have looked a wild thing, unshaven, eyes blazing with sleepless terror. "You have to leave the city," he begged, his voice cracking. "Go somewhere, anywhere. Don't tell anyone where." She looked at him, more pity than fear in her eyes. "Gabriel, are you okay? You look lost." "I am lost," he whispered. "We both are, in a story, and it's coming to the climax." He showed her the book then, in the back of his shop. He opened it to a page that now depicted the two of them, in stark, woodcut-like prose, standing in this very room. The text writhed as they watched, the ink bleeding into new sentences, describing this moment of revelation. Kendra's face went pale. She reached out, not to touch the book, but to touch his hand. "What does it want?" "An ending," Gabriel said, the truth a stone in his throat. "It's crafted a narrative from my loneliness and your light. It wants a resolution, a consummation. It offers a choice, a happy ending for the story. You, safe and whole, celebrated, loved, but the story closes, and we cease to be anything but characters on a page. Or a tragic ending. One of us..." The lights in the shop flickered. The shadows in the corners deepened, thickened, began to drip onto the floor. The smell of ozone and old paper filled the air. From the walls, a low, rhythmic chanting began. The words indistinguishable, but the cadence that of the book's most hypnotic passages. It was here. The book was making its final edit on reality. Kendra gripped his hand. "Then we choose, together." But the choice was his alone. The book was his antagonist, born from his own depths. The climax was a whirlwind of manifested prose. The sentient darkness of the shop coalesced into forms suggested by 100 terrible readings. Things with pages for skin and ink for blood, whispering his own fears back at him in perfect iambic pentameter. It was a literary haunting, a nightmare made of metaphor and desire. He saw two paths, laid out by the flickering light. In one, he pushed Kendra toward the door, toward the mundane world. He would turn and face the gathering darkness. Let it consume him. Let the story have its tragic, noble sacrifice. The book would be satisfied. Kendra would live, always wondering, always carrying a ghost of a story she could never quite remember. In the other, he took her hand and ran with her, out of the shop, into the night. They would flee, together, and the story would simply follow. A perpetual, hungry third, its ending forever deferred. its horrors woven into the fabric of their shared life. A cosmic, chasing tale with no final page. He looked at Kendra, her face a masterpiece of fear and defiance. He looked at the book, lying open on the desk, its pages now blank, waiting for the ending to be written in blood or breath. The rhythmic pulse was everywhere now, in the walls, in the air, in the core of him. He made his choice. He did not push her away. He did not face the darkness. Instead, he walked to the desk, took the book in his hands, its warmth now a fever heat, and he began to read aloud. Not from the written words, for they were gone. He read from the story he saw in Kendra's eyes, from the terror in the room, from the relentless pulse of his own heart. He read a new sentence, one of his own making, a sentence of defiance, not of the book, but of endings themselves. His voice merged with the rhythmic chant from the walls, a counterpoint, a new melody in the dark nursery rhyme. The manifested horrors hesitated, their forms shimmering, caught between the old text and the new. Gabriel took Kendra's hand, and together they stepped not out the door, but into the narrative itself, into the space between the lines. The shop dissolved around them into a landscape of shifting text, of forests made of whispered adjectives, and skies of swirling punctuation-starred prose. The final page of the physical book, left behind on the desk, filled with a single looping sentence, written in an ink that looked like black blood under moonlight. And so they walked into the story, hand in hand, forever reading, forever reading, forever read. And the pulse of it beat on in the silent world, a tale without an end, a whisper in the dark of every book yet to be opened. In a quiet apartment, a man named Jeff Halsey, gaunt and forever hungry, paused in his endless reading of a newspaper. He lifted his head, as if hearing a distant, familiar rhythm. He smiled a thin, paper-cut smile, and turned the page. The coffee shop on the corner had a new barista. She was efficient, cheerful, with a streak of purple in her dark hair. Gabriel watched her from his usual table, the one by the window that caught the afternoon light. He no longer felt the tremor in his bones. Instead, there was a constant, low hum, a resonance that lived just beneath his skin, a tuning fork that had found its permanent note. It was not unpleasant. It was the feeling of being written, and of writing in return. Kendra sat across from him, sketching in a large pad. She drew the new barista, but the lines kept shifting, becoming something else. A tree with bark like folded paper, a creature with eyes made of quotation marks. She didn't seem to notice. She would glance at the drawing, frown slightly, and then her hand would move again, as if guided. "It's quieter today," she said, not looking up. Gabriel nodded. The world had settled into a new equilibrium. The angles of the buildings had softened back to normal. The shadows behaved. But the texture of things was different. Sometimes, when he touched the spine of an old book in his shop, he could feel the story inside it not as words, but as a faint, sleeping pulse. Sometimes he could hear the faintest echo of a narrative in the rustle of leaves or the pattern of rain on the pavement. The world had become a palimpsest, and he had learned to read the layers. The book was gone from his desk, but it was not destroyed. It was simply elsewhere. He could feel it, a presence in the periphery, a weight in a parallel shelf space. It was satisfied for now. Their choice, to step into the narrative, to become co-authors rather than characters, had been an acceptable, if unexpected, resolution. The story continued, and so it fed. Halsey had vanished completely. Gabriel sometimes wondered if he had finally found an ending that satisfied his own hunger, or if he had simply become a footnote in another, deeper tale. Kendra finished her sketch and turned the pad around. It was a beautiful, unsettling image of the two of them, sitting at this table. But the coffee shop around them was made of intricate, swirling text. Their own faces were clear, detailed, alive, but from their hands resting on the table, fine lines of script flowed out, weaving into the environment, becoming the wood grain, the steam from their cups, the very light in the window. "It's us," she said, her voice soft with a wonder that had long since replaced her fear. "It is," Gabriel agreed. He reached out and traced a line of the drawn script with his finger. It felt warm. The new barista called out an order. The sound was just a sound, but to Gabriel, it carried a subtle cadence, a rhythm that matched the hum in his blood. He caught Kendra's eye, and she gave a small, knowing smile. She heard it too. They were both listening now, to the story they were in, and to the stories all around them. He paid for their coffee, leaving a generous tip. As they stepped out onto the street, the ordinary bustle of the city greeted them. Cars, conversations, the scent of food from a cart. But beneath it, woven through it, was the other narrative, the one they walked in, the one they shaped with every step, every glance, every quiet word between them. It was not a prison. It was a library, and they had graduated from readers to librarians, tending to the endless, whispering shelves of what is, what was, and what might yet be told. The pulse beat on, a quiet, constant rhythm in the heart of things. And Gabriel Thorne, once a curator of dead stories, finally felt alive. Narration. Story 4. The chill began in the corner of the room. A private winter. Eric felt it first against his cheek as he lay on the thin mattress, a precise column of cold air descending from the ceiling, as if the night itself had opened a vein. It was not the damp, salt-tinged cold of the island, but something sterile and surgical, a cold that spoke of absence, not weather. He did not move. He let it frost his skin, his breath pluming in the moonlight that sliced through the single high window. This was his, a secret signal. The house, a gaunt timber skeleton shingled in peeling gray, slept around him, but its bones were never still. They creaked with the island's exhalations, with the weight of his father's dreams in the room below. Franklin, his father, was a man carved from the same wind-whipped granite that fringed the shore. His control was a silent, atmospheric pressure. He spoke in directives, not conversations. The rules of the house were its architecture. Eric was to tend the generator, to mend the nets that were never used, to walk the high ridge and watch for ships that never came. The island, 3 miles of peat and pine and sharp rock off a forgotten stretch of Maine coast, was their kingdom. Its isolation was Franklin's masterpiece. But Franklin did not know about the chill or the rituals. He only knew the result of them, the grim harvest that Eric presented with downcast eyes. The rituals belonged to the cove on the eastern shore, a crescent of black sand hidden by teeth-like rocks. They began with the animals. A seabird with a broken wing, found struggling in the tide pools. A fox, thin and desperate, caught in a snare Eric had laid not for food, but for purpose. He would carry them to the cove at dusk, his movements slow, reverent. He did not think of it as cruelty. It was a translation. He would build a small, neat pyre of driftwood, place the creature upon it, and whisper the words that came to him not from memory, but from the chill itself, words that felt like smooth stones in his mouth. Then, the match. The flame did not crackle joyfully. It consumed with a silent, blue-tinged intensity, and the creature would not struggle. It would watch him, its eyes reflecting the tiny conflagration, until the light went out. The ashes he would collect in a glass jar. A row of them on a shelf in his room, labeled in his careful script. Gull, 9:14. Fox, 10:3. Tern, 10. They were prayers. But to what? He did not know. His father's rituals were different, performed in the locked root cellar. Eric would hear him down there at night. Not the sound of tools, but a low, monotonous murmuring. A sound like stone grinding against stone. Once, Franklin emerged with his hands stained not with dirt, but with a rusty, flaking pigment, the color of dried blood. He saw Eric looking and said nothing, only held his gaze until Eric looked away. The unspoken command colder than the columnar chill. There were others in the house, though not in flesh. Judy, his mother, was a presence in the faded photographs that Franklin kept in a warped album. Her smile bleached by time. Her eyes, Amina's eyes, looked out from the paper. Amina, the sister. The first jar? The word accident was the only stone Franklin ever turned over to reveal the darkness beneath. She had fallen from the cliff path, he said. She was 10. Eric had been 6. He remembered a scream that seemed to go on forever, not fading, but being absorbed by the sea wind until the air itself was saturated with it. He remembered his father returning to the house alone, his face a mask of something beyond grief, something like grim satisfaction. After that, the chill began. After that, Franklin started going to the root cellar. The revelations came not in a flood, but in a slow, chilling drip, like water from a crack in a tomb. It was the fox jar that broke. He reached for it on the high shelf, and it slipped, shattering on the floorboards, a gray powder fanning out like a ghost. Kneeling to clean it, his fingers found the edge of a loose board. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. His mother's handwriting, a looping, elegant script that seemed alien in the crude house. They were not love letters. They were pleas. Franklin, I cannot stay here. I see what you are doing to her. To Amina. You call it clarifying the blood. You call it peeling back the mortal veil. But I see her eyes. She is not our little girl anymore. She speaks to things in the corners. She draws symbols that make my head ache. I am taking her. I am leaving tomorrow with a supply boat. The last letter was a single line, dated the day of the accident. You said you would let us go. You lied. Eric sat on the floor, the ash of the fox dusting his knees. The chill in the room intensified, concentrating around him, a cocoon of winter. He heard, not with his ears, but in the marrow of his bones, a faint, echoing laughter that was both a child's giggle and the sound of dry leaves skittering over stone. That night, he did not wait for his father to go to the cellar. He went to the cliff path, to the place where the rock was sheer and the waves gnawed at the base far below. The moon was full, a cold coin, and he saw her. Amina Dud. Not a memory, but a figure etched in moonlight and shadow, standing on the very edge, her back to him. She wore the same yellow dress from the photographs. She turned her head, and her face was not a child's face, but a shifting, porous thing, like clay being worked by invisible hands. It held the echo of his mother's beauty, and the terrible, serene emptiness of the fox's final gaze. It didn't push me. Her voice was the whisper of the tide in a sea cave. He offered me. A door had to be opened. A family must have a key holder. I was the key. But a key turns both ways, Eric. She pointed a slender, pale finger not at the abyss, but back toward the house. He is making another door. He is almost done. He needs a new key, a stronger one. One he has been preparing. The understanding wrapped around Eric's heart, colder than the chill, heavier than stone. The rituals were not his own. They were a rehearsal. The burning, the whispering, the collection of essence. It was all practice, imprinted upon him by the presence that was his sister, the keyholder, the thing his father had forged from his own child. Franklin was not just withholding secrets. He was architecting a successor. The island was not a prison. It was a chapel. and Eric was the intended sacrament. He ran back to the house, not in fear, but in a terrible, clear-headed fury. The root cellar door was unlocked. The murmuring from within was louder, a chanting that vibrated in his teeth. He descended the rough-hewn steps. The cellar was not a cellar. The earth had been excavated into a wide, domed chamber. The walls were covered in intricate, spiraling designs painted in that same rusty pigment. In the center stood Franklin, bare-chested, his back a tapestry of old scars that mirrored the symbols on the walls. Before him, on a stone slab, lay the body of a large gray seal, its throat cut, its dark eyes open. The air reeked of copper and low-tide decay. Franklin turned. His eyes held no surprise, only a weary triumph. "You're early. The alignment is not until dawn." "You killed her," Eric said, his voice steady. "I elated her," Franklin corrected, his tone that of a patient teacher. "Our line, it has an affinity, a thinness. Your mother's family knew, but they called it madness. They tried to dilute it. I have spent my life refining it. Amina was the proof of concept. But she was fragile. The door she opened, she could not fully close. She'll have an..." Eric looked past his father, to the far wall. There, painted larger than all the rest, was a design that was not a symbol, but a portrait. It was a crude, powerful rendering of a figure that was both Eric and not Eric, its form merging with twisting, non-Euclidean shapes, holding a key that was also a flame. He did not argue. He did not scream. He simply walked forward, past his father, to the stone slab. He placed his hand on the seal's cold flank. He looked at the intricate work, the care, the years of monstrous devotion. He felt the chill of the room focus on his spine, a supportive, sisterly touch. Then he picked up the heavy iron lantern that sat on the floor. Franklin smiled, a grim stretching of lips. "Yes, accept the light." Eric swung the lantern not at his father, but in a wide, furious arc, dashing it against the stone wall where the pigment was thickest. The glass shattered. The oil, blessed by the flame within, erupted. It did not burn like common fire. It crawled. It slithered up the painted symbols with a hungry, sentient greed, tracing every line, setting the rusty pigment ablaze with a cold, greenish light. The chamber was suddenly alive with dancing, malevolent geometry. Franklin's roar was not of anger, but of utter, catastrophic despair. "No! You'd understand. You've broken the pattern." "I'm the pattern," Eric whispered, as the flames found the peat-rich earth of the walls, the dry timber supports. He climbed the stairs as the cellar filled with smoke and that awful greenish incandescence. He did not look back. He walked out of the house, across the rocky headland, to the cliff path. He did not stop at the place where Amina had stood. He walked to the very edge, where the world fell away into the roaring star-flecked black. He felt a hand slip into his. It was small and cold as deep ocean water. He did not look down. "It needs a key," Amina's voice sighed from beside him. "I know," he said. Behind them, the house groaned. A pillar of strange, silent fire, visible only as a distortion in the night. A heat haze of wrongness shot up from its foundation and pierced the sky. For a moment, the stars seemed to rearrange themselves, drawn to the column like iron filings. Then, with a sound like a vast intake of breath, the light vanished. The house stood, dark and intact. No smoke, no flame, just stillness. At the cliff's edge, there was nothing. No Eric, no ghostly sister, just the endless, patient sigh of the sea below, and the cold, salt wind sweeping across the empty rock. On the island, in the gray house, Everything was still. In Eric's room, the row of glass jars sat on their shelf, undisturbed. The floorboard was neatly back in place. In the root cellar, the walls were bare, packed earth. The stone slab was clean. The air smelled of damp and potatoes. Franklin sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded before him. He stared at the wall, his eyes empty. He would sit there until dawn, and then he would begin his chores. He would check the generator. He would walk the high ridge, watching for ships that never came. He was alone. Perfectly, utterly alone. The chill was gone. The rituals were complete. The door was finally, mercifully, closed. The silence that remained was absolute, a silence so deep it was not an absence of sound, but a thing in itself, solid and eternal, as if nothing had ever happened. The silence in the house was a new kind of cold. It was not the focused, private winter of the chill, but a total vacuum, a hollowing out of the very air. Franklin moved through the days with mechanical precision. He ate tasteless meals. He mended a length of rope, his fingers working by rote. The island's wind still spoke, but it no longer carried whispers. It was just weather now. He found himself standing at the door to Eric's room one afternoon, his hand on the knob. He had not entered since. He turned it and pushed the door open. The room was neat, spare, as it had always been. The thin mattress was tightly made. The shelf with the jars was empty. Not broken, not disturbed. Simply empty. The jars were gone. Franklin's breath caught, a jagged thing in his chest. He crossed the room in 2 strides and ran his hand along the smooth wood of the shelf. There was no dust. He knelt, his old knees cracking, and pried up the loose floorboard with his fingernails. The space beneath was empty. No bundle of letters, no trace of ash. He let the board fall back into place with a soft, final click. That night, he went to the root cellar. The lantern light revealed only dirt walls, shelves of preserves, the mundane detritus of survival. He traced a line on the wall where a spiral had once been, his fingers coming away clean. A profound, unanswerable question began to form in the silence of his mind. Had it worked, or had it failed? The door was closed. The affliction, the gift, the thinness, it was gone. That was the goal. The silence was the proof. But the cost. He had prepared for a sacrifice. He had prepared for a transformation. He had not prepared for an erasure. He took to walking the island's perimeter, a slow, trudging patrol. He avoided the eastern cove. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea, he found himself on the cliff path. He stood at the spot, the exact spot. He looked down at the crashing waves, then out at the horizon. A single, stark thought cleaved through the numbness. He did not know which of them had jumped, or if either had needed to. A week later, the supply boat came. It was a rare event, dictated by the weather and the captain's whim. Franklin rowed out to meet it in the dinghy, as he always did. The captain, a grizzled man named Hollis, handed down crates of fuel, flour, and other necessities. "Quiet out here," Hollis remarked, lighting his pipe. "Where's the boy? Usually he helps with the heavy stuff." Franklin looked up from securing a crate. He met Hollis's eyes. "Gone," he said, the word flat and heavy. Hollis was silent for a long moment, puffing on his pipe. "Gone? Took the skiff in this weather?" "No," Franklin said. "Just gone." He expected questions, suspicion, perhaps even an accusation. But Hollis only nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his weathered face. "This place," he said, not unkindly. "It takes things, swallows them up. Your wife, your little girl, now the boy." He shook his head. "You staying, Franklin?" "Yes." Suit yourself. Hollis cast off the lines. As the boat chugged away, he gave a final solemn wave, not of farewell, but of mourning. Franklin rowed back to shore. The silence welcomed him, settling over his shoulders like a familiar, threadbare coat. He carried the supplies up to the house, one crate at a time. The work was hard, and he was alone. That night, he sat again at the kitchen table. The house creaked, an ordinary sound of timber contracting in the cool night. He listened, straining for something else, for the murmur, for the chill, for a sign. There was nothing. He went to bed. He slept, and in his dream, he was in the root cellar again. But it was as it had been. The symbols glowed with their own inner light. On the slab lay the seal, its dark eye watching him, and standing beside it were two figures. A woman in a faded yellow dress, her face a shifting memory, and a young man, his features calm, his hands stained with soft gray ash. They were not looking at him. They were looking at the wall, at the great painted door, and they were holding hands. Franklin woke with a gasp. The room was pitch black, silent. He fumbled for the lantern, lit it. The flame was just a flame, yellow and warm. He got up and walked, the lantern casting shaky shadows, down the hall, to Eric's room. He opened the door. On the empty shelf, in the very center, sat a single glass jar. It was clean, full of what looked like fine, pale sand. There was no label. Franklin approached it, his heart a dull drum in his ears. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cool glass. Inside, the sand shifted. Not from his touch, from within. It swirled, forming a tiny, perfect vortex before settling again into stillness. He did not move the jar. He did not take it. He simply stood there, watching it, until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the high window. It was not a message of forgiveness. It was not a threat. It was a presence. A confirmation. The door was closed, yes, but something had been left on the threshold. He turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. He had chores to do. The generator needed tending. The high ridge needed walking. He was alone, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was listening, and so was he. The days folded into one another, a seamless gray blanket of routine. Franklin performed his chores with a new attentiveness, his ears tuned to the quality of the silence. It was no longer flat. It had texture, a density that varied like barometric pressure. Sometimes in the kitchen he would feel a faint, cool spot in the air, a place where the temperature dropped for no reason. He would stop, a plate in his hand, and wait. But nothing else would happen. It was just a cool spot. He began to leave offerings. Not the complex, bloody rituals of before, but small, simple things. A bowl of fresh water by the back door. A smooth stone placed on the windowsill of Eric's room. He did not know why he did it. It felt necessary, like tending a very quiet, invisible garden. One morning, he found the bowl of water empty, though no animal could have reached it. The stone on the windowsill had been turned over. He refilled the bowl. He left the stone as it was. The supply boat did not return on its next scheduled run. A storm system settled over the northern sea, and weeks stretched into a month. Franklin ran low on kerosene and began to use the old candles stored in the root cellar. Their light was softer, more forgiving. It made the shadows in the corners of the house seem less like voids and more like resting places. He took to sitting in the parlor in the evenings, a blanket over his knees, watching the candle flame. One night the flame did something peculiar. It did not flicker in a draft. It bent, slowly, as if drawn toward the hallway. It stretched into a thin, blue-tipped teardrop, pointing like a compass needle. Franklin followed its indication with his eyes. It pointed down the dark hall, toward the closed door of Eric's room. He stood, the blanket falling to the floor. He picked up the candlestick and walked, the bent flame guiding him. He pushed open the door. The room was as he had left it, spare and neat. The single jar still sat on the shelf, but now on the floor beneath the shelf was a small, neat pile of gray ash. It was shaped deliberately, not spilled. It was a tiny, perfect spiral. Franklin knelt. He did not touch the ash. He studied the spiral, its lines precise and confident. It was the same form that had once covered the cellar walls, but rendered here in this soft, dead powder. A signature. A sign. "Eric," he whispered. The name rusted from disuse. The candle flame snapped back to its normal shape, upright and golden. But in the sudden stillness, Franklin heard it. Not with his ears. It was a sensation, a vibration in his teeth, just like the chanting from the cellar used to be. But this was not a chant. It was a single sustained note, clear and cold as an ice crystal. It held no words, only a feeling. It was not anger. It was not forgiveness. It was attention. He understood then. The door was closed, but the key holders remained. They were not gone. They were simplified, reduced to their essence, like the creatures in Eric's jars. They were a presence, a condition of the house, a part of the island's weather. They were the cool spot in the air, the turned stone, the spiral of ash. They were the silence that listened. He blew out the candle and sat there on the floor in the dark. The note faded, but the feeling of attention remained, a gentle, unblinking pressure. He was not alone. He would never be alone again. His life's work had succeeded and failed in the same breath. He had clarified the blood, peeled back the veil, and what was left on this side was not a god, not a monster, but a quiet domestic haunt. A family, translated. Tomorrow, he would check the generator. He would walk the high ridge. He would watch for a boat that might never come. And he would leave a bowl of fresh water by the door. No. Story 5. The wallpaper in the waiting room was not smooth. Eddie's index finger traced the same 6-inch path, over and over, feeling the subtle velvety ridges of the damask pattern. It was the texture of a well-kept tomb, he thought. A dry and powdery softness that seemed to drink the sound from the air. Each ridge was a tiny man-made mountain range, and in the valleys between, he imagined things could hide. The motion was a silent metronome, a feeble attempt to keep time with the frantic clockwork of his own heart. Outside, a late October rain whispered against the window, blurring the world into a watercolor of gray and brown. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the ventilation and the occasional, muffled turn of a page from the receptionist behind her glass partition. Normalcy.ro, a curated, expensive normalcy. This was the 7th floor of the Meridian Center for Wellness, and everything here was designed to soothe. Yet for Eddie, the very air felt charged, thick with the unspoken histories of everyone who had ever sat in this same chair, tracing this same pattern, waiting to spill their secrets. He did not need them to speak to know their secrets. He saw them. It had begun subtly, a year ago, after the accident. The one that took his sister, the one he walked away from with, only a hairline fracture and a silence that grew teeth. At first, it was just a sense of pressure in a crowded room, a metallic taste at the back of his throat when someone stood too close. Then came the colors. Not true colors, but perceptions of color like heat haze over asphalt. A faint, flickering indigo around his neighbor's temples, a pulsing, sickly yellow-green around the cashier's hands. He learned their meanings through inadvertent touch. Handshake with his neighbor, who had a limp hand and eyes that never quite met his. And Eddie was swamped with a cold, drowning sensation, the image of a car's interior filling with dark water. The indigo was shame, passing change to the cashier, their fingers brushing, and a searing, acidic pain shot up his arm, accompanied by the smell of ammonia and the sound of a slamming door. The yellow-green was fear, a specific, domesticated terror. He was a silent, unwilling archaeologist of personal cataclysm. Everyone carried their own museum of ruin, and Eddie's new site granted him a free, horrifying admission. He called them auras, for lack of a better word, hallows of harm. His friend Cameron, the only one he'd told, called it a curse. "You're not a trauma sponge, Eddie," he'd say, his own outline mercifully, consistently clear. "You're a man with a broken filter. You need to fix it, not learn to live with it." But Eddie couldn't fix it. He could only manage it. Management meant Dr. Christy Van Stickens. Her door opened, and the receptionist nodded. Eddie stood, his knees popping in the quiet. He walked toward the doorway, already feeling the emanation from within. It was different today. Stronger. Christie's office was a study in calm. Soft earth tones, a thriving fiddle leaf fig in the corner, shelves of books that actually looked red. She sat in her usual chair, a notepad on her lap, and smiled. It was a warm smile, practiced and genuine. "Eddie, how are you today?" He sat, the leather of the armchair cool through his shirt. "The same," he said, his voice a rough thing. He couldn't look directly at her. Not yet, because around Christy Vance swirled an aura of such profound and complicated violence that it stole the breath from his lungs. It was not a single color, but a nebula. Deep, bruised violets coiled like smoke around her torso, a profound physical violation. Jagged bolts of that acidic yellow-green, the fear, shot through it intermittently. But the dominant hue, the one that pulsed with a low thermal heat, was a rusty, arterial red. Rage. Not a hot rage, but a cold, ancient and patient one, folded and refolded over decades until it was as dense as a neutron star. It was the most beautiful and terrible thing he had ever seen. He found himself both repelled and mesmerized, a moth to a flame that he knew would taste of ash and copper. "You're focusing on my aura again," Christy said gently. Her voice was a smooth stone in a stream. Eddie flinched. He'd never told her the specifics, only that he had intrusive visual thoughts about people's pain. "It's loud today, is it?" She shifted, crossing her legs. "And what does that tell you?" "It tells me you had a bad weekend," Eddie muttered, finally meeting her eyes. They were a clear, intelligent gray. They gave nothing of the storm away. "Perhaps," she conceded. "Or perhaps your sensitivity is increasing. We've discussed this. Your mind, in its attempt to make sense of your own survivor's guilt, may be projecting narratives onto others. A form of empathetic hypervigilance." He wanted to believe her. He desperately wanted this to be a fiction of his own broken mind. But the sensations were too real, too specific, and they lingered. The session continued, a dance of careful probing and evasive answers. As the 50 minutes bled away, Eddie felt the usual urge building in his hands, a tingling, magnetic pull. It was an itch in the center of his palms, a hunger. He had discovered, through terrible accident, that if he made skin-to-skin contact while focusing on an aura, he could pull it. Not all of it, but a thread. The act brought a momentary, shocking clarity to his own mind, a silencing of his constant, buzzing anxiety, as if his own pain was drowned out by a louder signal. It was addictive, and it had consequences. "Our time is up," Christy said, standing. She walked him to the door as she always did. "Today?" She paused, her hand on the knob. "You seem more agitated than usual, Eddie. Are you safe?" The question, the proximity, the overwhelming swirl of her trauma nebula broke his resolve. As he reached to shake her offered hand, a professional parting gesture, he let his focus drop into that maelstrom of color. Their palms met. The world vanished. There was no office. There was the smell of pine-scented cleaner and old beer. There was the rough texture of shag carpet against his cheek. There was the deafening, thunderous roar of a man's voice, not in anger, but in a terrible sing-song mockery that was worse than any shout. There was the weight, the crushing, breath-stealing weight of a larger body, and the sharp, bright pain of a small bone, a finger snapping like a wishbone. And underpinning it all, that cold, red rage, not as a victim's emotion, but as a thing being forged in the fire of humiliation, a diamond of hatred forming under pressure. It was not a memory he saw. It was a memory he wore. He gasped, wrenching his hand back, stumbling into the hallway. Christie's face was pale. Her composed mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of something as dark and surprised as his own stolen knowledge. "Eddie? I'm fine," he choked out, and fled. The rain had hardened into needles. Eddie drove through the washed-out streets, the ghost of Christie's trauma clinging to him like a second skin. The cold, red rage was a coal in his stomach. His own anxiety was blessedly, utterly silent. He felt powerful, clear, and deeply, profoundly sick. He went to Cameron's apartment, a cluttered, warm space that usually felt like a sanctuary. Tonight, it felt small. "You did it again," Cameron said, watching Eddie scrub his hands under the kitchen faucet. "You took something, don't lie. Your eyes are all quiet. It's creepy." "It helps," Eddie said, the water scalding his skin. "It's stealing," Cameron shot back. "And where does it go, Eddie? That pain you peel off people. It doesn't just vanish. Energy doesn't work like that." Eddie didn't have an answer. He went home to his silent apartment. He slept a black, dreamless sleep. And in the morning, he saw it. It was in the corner of his bedroom, where the shadow from the oak tree outside always lingered. At first, he thought it was just a heap of dirty laundry, a trick of the dawnlight. But it had a shape, a hunched, broad-shouldered silhouette sitting with its back to him. It was made of shades, not substance, a coagulation of shadow and the faint residual glow of all the colors had ever absorbed. The indigo of shame formed a thick, corded muscle across its back. The yellow-green fear shimmered like a sickly sweat on its skin. And through it all, pulsing like a lazy heart, were threads of that new, rusty red rage from Christie. It was not looking at him. It was simply present. A bodyguard. He blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, he told himself. A waking dream. The price of clarity. But it came back. Not every day, and never in the same place. He would catch a glimpse of it in the rain-blurred window of a passing bus, a dark shape keeping pace. He would see its reflection in his coffee maker, standing silently in the doorway of his kitchen. It was always turned away, a monument to witness sorrow. It grew more defined with each act of absorption. A handshake with a grieving widow at the grocery store, the cold gray aura of loss, gave it defined fingers, knuckles like stone. Brushing against a jumpy veteran on the subway, the jagged orange aura of panic sharpened its posture, made it seem alert, predatory. He confessed to Cameron, who listened with growing horror. "You're manifesting it," Cameron whispered. "You're feeding it. It's a golem made of grief. You have to stop." "I can't," Eddie said. And it was the truth. The silence he bought with each theft was too sweet. The monster was the cost, and he was learning to live with it. His sessions with Christie became a dangerous ballet. Her aura never diminished. If anything, it grew more intense, more fascinating. She began to ask more pointed questions about his visualizations. She seemed less interested in treating his anxiety and more in cataloging his ability. The monster grew stronger, more physical, He could sometimes hear it breathing, a low, rasping sound like wind through a crack in a tomb. The crisis point came on a night of howling wind. Eddie, in a foolish moment of need, had taken a thread of pain from a crying child in the park. A simple blue sadness over a lost toy. The act felt petty, vile. That night, the monster was not in the corner. It was sitting at the foot of his bed. He could see the texture of it now, the rough, bark-like skin of swallowed shame, the glistening strands of fear sweat, the pulsing, volcanic veins of rage. It radiated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. His phone buzzed. "Cameron, it's outside my window, Eddie, on the fire escape. It's looking at me." The voice was pure terror. Eddie's own fear, long suppressed, roared back to life. He had done this. He had fed this thing, and now it was expanding its territory. "Don't look at it," Eddie breathed. "I'm coming." He drove through the storm-racked streets, the wipers fighting a losing battle. The monster was no longer just in reflections. He saw it loping alongside the car, keeping pace with impossible speed, a shadow with substance. It was no longer just his bodyguard. It was becoming his herald. He found Cameron barricaded in his bathroom, face white. "It's gone," Cameron said, "but it wanted me to see it. It's learning. I have to get rid of it," Eddie said, the realization a cold stone in his gut. "I have to give it back." "How?" Cameron cried. "You can't just shove that stuff back into people." But Eddie knew. There was only one source vast enough, potent enough, to possibly absorb the conglomerate horror he had created. Christy Vance and her neutron star trauma. It was a terrible logic. He would give the monster to the one whose pain was great enough to perhaps contain it. He went to the Meridian Center at midnight. He used the key code she had given him for a supposed crisis session months ago, a gesture of trust he now violated. The 7th floor was dark, silent except for the hum of the building. Her office door was unlocked. She was there, standing by the window, looking out at the storm. She did not turn. "I knew you'd come tonight, Eddie. The air has been heavy." "You can feel it?" he asked, his voice small. "I've always been able to feel things," she said softly. "It's why I became a therapist, to be near the wounds, to understand the shapes they make." She finally turned. Her aura was a silent, screaming supernova around her, the red rage now a dominant, swirling corona. "You have a gift. You don't just see, you collect. It's not a gift. It made something, and I need you to take it from me." She smiled, and it was not a warm smile. It was a recognition. "You want to give your pain to me, your little conglomerate ghost? You think my museum has room for one more exhibit?" He took a step forward, his hands trembling. "It's not just mine. It's everyone's. And it's outside. It's real." As if on cue, the window trembled. A shape, darker than the night, occluded the stormlit sky. A massive hand, woven from sorrow and fury, pressed against the glass. The pane groaned, a spider web of cracks exploding from the point of pressure. Christie's eyes widened, not with fear, but with a voracious, awful hunger. "Oh," she breathed. "It's beautiful. Take it." Eddie screamed, lunging forward. He didn't plan to touch her, but he stumbled. His hands, palms open, slapped against her temples. He opened the floodgates. He poured every stolen thread, every hue of hurt, every shudder and scream he had absorbed, directly into the maelstrom of her being. He pushed the image of the monster, its form, its presence, its loyalty, into the core of her cold, red rage. The transfer was not gentle. It was a cataclysm. The window shattered inward, but no monster entered. Instead, the monster outside, and the phantom inside Eddie unraveled. He saw its form dissolve, not into nothing, but into a river of colored light, a spectral torrent that flowed from the night, through the broken window, and into Christy Vance. She arched her back, mouth open in a soundless scream, as the collective trauma of 100 strangers merged with her own. Eddie fell to the floor, emptied, scoured clean. His anxiety was gone. His sight was gone. The world was blessedly, terrifyingly mute and gray. Christy slumped against the wall, then slowly straightened. She looked at her hands, turned them over. She was calm, serene. The terrifying aura was gone. Completely. She was just a woman in a ruined office. "Thank you, Eddie," she said, her voice smooth as polished marble. "It's quiet now. For the first time, it's finally quiet." She walked past him, stepping over the broken glass, and out the door. Her footsteps echoed down the dark hall, precise and steady. Eddie crawled to the shattered window. The rain had stopped. The city below glittered, cold and clean. He was free. He felt nothing. No anxiety, no fear, no pity. He was an empty vessel. Down on the street, under a flickering sodium lamp, he saw Christy emerge from the building's front entrance. She did not look up. She began to walk down the deserted sidewalk. And behind her, sliding from the pooled shadows of an alley, a new shape followed. It was not hunched. It walked with a terrible, graceful symmetry. It was not a conglomerate of colors, but a pure, depthless silhouette, a cutout of absolute darkness in the world. It was taller, more defined, and it moved with a purpose the old monster never had. It fell into step 3 paces behind her, a perfect, silent attendant, a bodyguard, refined, consolidated, and utterly loyal. Eddie watched until they turned a corner and were gone, swallowed by the indifferent city. He sat back in the lake of glass, the cold air biting his skin. He was free, and he understood, with a clarity that was the most profound horror of all, that he had not given his monster away. He had simply delivered it to a more competent keeper. He had handed a weapon to a master, and the world, with all its silent, hidden pain, was now her gallery. He looked at his own hands, pale and ordinary in the dim light. They were just hands. They would never see, or feel, or steal again. The silence in his head was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a grave, of a held breath before an unthinkable dawn. It was the most terrifying sound he had ever heard, and it was his forever. The days that followed were a study in nothingness. Eddie went through the motions. He ate tasteless food, slept dreamless sleeps, and walked through a city that had been drained of its secret light. The absence of the auras was a physical emptiness, a missing limb that still itched. He found himself staring at people's hands, their eyes, waiting for the flicker that never came. He was blind in a new way. Cameron noticed immediately. "It's gone," he said, not a question. They were in the same kitchen, but the air was different. "You're gone." "I'm fine," Eddie said, and the words were ash. He was not fine. He was neutral, a wiped slate. "She called me," Cameron said, his voice low. "Christy Vance. Asked if I'd seen you. Said she was concerned about your abrupt termination of therapy." Her voice was calm, too calm. Eddie felt a stir, the faintest echo of something that might have been fear. "What did you say?" "I said you were on a trip. She said to wish you well." Cameron leaned forward. "Eddie, what did you do? What happened that night?" "I fixed it," Eddie whispered, but the words rang hollow. He had not fixed anything. He had transferred a debt. He began to watch the news with a new, numb focus. He scoured local reports, social media, police blotters. He was looking for a pattern, a signature. It arrived 2 weeks later, in a small article buried in the Metro section. A prominent, notoriously aggressive defense attorney, a man known for crushing witnesses on the stand, had been found in his locked Mercedes, dead of an apparent heart attack. The odd detail, the one that made the reporter linger, was that the man's face was frozen in an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. His hands were clamped over his ears, as if trying to block out a sound. No signs of struggle, no history of heart trouble. Eddie knew Dadhawasha. He felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. The attorney's name was familiar. With trembling fingers, he searched his own memory, and then his discarded aura-scribbled notebooks from the worst of his curse. There it was, 8 months ago. A woman in a coffee shop, her aura a shattered prism of violet and gray. He'd taken a thread, just a sip to quiet his own noise. The memory that came with it, the same attorney's face, smug and vicious, leaning over her in a courtroom, his voice a weapon. The violet was her shame. The gray was her despair. Christie was not just a keeper. She was a curator. And now she had the means to rearrange her exhibits. The next incident was clearer. A former police officer, early retirement after a questionable shooting, was discovered in his basement workshop. He had, according to the brief report, seemingly torn his own fingernails out. The workshop walls were covered in frantic, bloody scratches. The officer had been acquitted. Eddie didn't need his notebooks for this one. He remembered the aura of the teenage boy, a flickering, dying ember of orange panic from a chance encounter on a bus. The boy hadn't needed to speak. The aura had screamed the story of a flashlight beam in a dark alley, a looming uniform, the smell of gunpowder and sweat. She was hunting, using the composite monster, his monster, as a bloodhound. It could find the source of any pain she fed it, any color in her collection. It could track a specific signature of shame or fear or rage back to its originator. And then she would set it upon them. Not to kill necessarily, but to deliver, to force a reckoning. She was administering a terrible inverted justice, using the pain of the victim as the only weapon needed against the perpetrator. Eddie was the only one who knew. He was the architect of this. The silence in his head, once a coveted prize, became a prison. He was a bystander in a war he had armed. He tried to call her, to email her, to go to the Meridian Center. Her practice was closed. Indefinitely. She had vanished, a ghost with a shadow. One evening, he saw it. Or rather, he saw its effect. He was walking past a pawn shop, its windows crammed with forgotten things. Reflected in the dirty glass, for a fraction of a second, he saw a man behind him stop walking. The man's face went slack, then contorted in primal fear. He began to swat at the air around his head, screaming at nothing, before collapsing to the sidewalk. People rushed to help. Eddie turned, his heart a frozen lump. Across the street, standing in the doorway of a closed bookstore, was Christie Van Seen. She wore a simple trench coat. She met his eyes and gave a small, polite nod, as if acknowledging an acquaintance. Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, the streetlight's glow seemed to thicken and pull itself into a long, dark shape that flowed after her, stepping over the prone, twitching man without a glance. Eddie did not go to help the man. He knew what was happening to him. He was drowning in the fear he had sown in others, now refined and poured down his throat by a silent judge. He finally understood Cameron's old warning. Energy does not vanish. It had been transformed. His curse was now a societal force. His monster was now a sleek, efficient instrument of retribution. And he, Eddie, was the only one with the blueprint, the only one who knew the original sins that fueled it. But he was powerless. He had no sight, no pull, no way to intervene. He was a ghost, haunting the aftermath of his own actions. He went home and sat in the dark. The silence was complete. He waited, not knowing for what. For a knock? For a shadow at the window? For his own turn to receive a delivery? But nothing came. He was irrelevant. The transaction was complete. He had paid for his peace with the world's potential torment. The most terrifying sound was not a scream or a monster's breath. It was this silence, knowing what it cost, and knowing the bill was still being paid, out there in the night, by people who would never understand why they were suddenly, viscerally, afraid of the dark. Thank you for making it all the way to the end, and for joining me on another journey through our nighttime scary stories. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tales. And to help our channel grow, wishing you a calm, peaceful good night, and I'll see you tomorrow with a brand new story.